The air in his small Texas house was thick with the heat of late summer, and the fan in the living room pushed only warm, tired air in lazy circles. Daniel rubbed his temple, trying to anchor himself to the simple facts: the cheap mattress, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table, the mailbox full of flyers. People in town called him a quiet man, the kind who nodded to neighbors but kept his life folded tight, like the shirts in his closet. There were nights, though, when his memory failed him, when a whole hour could be gone as if someone had erased a page. He would wake with soil under his nails and a thin, faded rope burn around his wrist, and he would stand in the bathroom, blinking at himself as if seeing a stranger. At first he blamed the job. At first he blamed stress. At first he believed sleepwalking. Then came the first whisper. It was soft and patient, like someone clearing their throat in the next room. It said only his name, Daniel. He thought it came from the street, a neighbor calling. He walked to the window and peered down at the patch of cracked sidewalk and the low curb, and there was no one. The whisper came again that night, from the corner where the old mirror hung in the hallway. He'd bought that mirror for $20 at an estate sale, the kind of hand-me-down glass that carried other people's dust and polite secrets. He'd hung it opposite his bedroom door so the hall looked longer, like a line stretching beyond the house. When he switched off the lights that first night after the whisper, his reflection did not quite match his movements. He raised his hand slowly, and in the glass, a beat later, his reflection's hand rose a half-second behind, as if the glass had an echo of its own. He laughed the first time, a small bark of nervousness. He told himself the bulb was loose, that his eyes were tired, that the mind can play tricks when you're alone. But the delay got longer. The reflection smirked minutes after he had stopped smiling, and once, when he looked away, he saw in the glass a silhouette step back from the mirror that he had not stepped back from in the room. 2 nights in a row, he woke on the couch with the television on and a single cup of coffee in the sink. He had no memory of making either. Then a neighbor's kid went missing for a day, and the town passed around theories about where the boy might have wandered. Daniel attended the search without speaking. He scanned the crowd like a man peering at a mural in the hope of recognizing himself in the paint. He felt the other one, the thing that moved to his reflections off rhythm, like a presence gathering at the edge of the room, patient and hungry. At times the house itself seemed to shift. Doorways grew narrower, the hallway lengthened by a step. The cellar door that had always stuck like old skin now opened with a quick, eager creak. He told himself he would stop. He put a chair in front of the mirror. He nailed the chair legs to the floor because the thought of not being able to stop frightened him more than the chair itself. The whispers became instructions. They were rarely direct. They never said go. They suggested, shaped, sounded like someone remembering how something should be done. When he slept, he dreamed of a hand stretching from the glass, fingers like pale roots finding a throat. He woke with that image burned into his memory, though it was never real when he opened his eyes. But whatever waited in the reflective surface found other ways in. The next morning, someone at work muttered to a coworker about a missing photograph. Daniel remembered picking up an envelope and slipping the picture into his pocket on his way home. Later, he found it in the glove box under a layer of dust he did not remember making. Then someone reported a disappearance, a young waitress who had been working late and walking home. Security cameras recorded a man wearing Daniel's jacket, walking her toward a building on the block where his house sat. The footage blinked and then restarted in the middle. The man's mouth moved, but the soundtrack lost a full minute and resumed like a tape with a missing segment. He found dried mud on his boots and the trace odor of someone else's perfume lingering in his coat. He cut a nail on the way to work one morning, and beneath the torn nail bed was a sliver of ribbon, blue, the color of someone's uniform. He could not remember where it came from. He stopped sleeping in the bed. He slept on the couch now, lights on, shoes still by the door. He bought a cheap padlock and secured the cellar door. He put signs on the windows, alarm, private property, no trespassing. He kept them lit in the night with a lamp so the house looked occupied. The next incident was not like a dream. It was as ordinary as a Tuesday, and then it was not ordinary at all. He woke up at noon in the driver's seat of his truck with a sleeve caked in mud and his hands smelling faintly of bleach. He had no memory of leaving the house, no memory of driving. His phone had a missed call from the sheriff. A girl had been found tied in a basement of a house 2 blocks from his, alive, soaked with dirt and terrified. The sheriff wanted to know if Daniel had any information. Daniel said no. Daniel said he had been at home. Daniel did not know he had been driving through the town like someone carrying a shadow behind him. When the sheriff came by his house that afternoon, they asked to look in the cellar. Daniel widened his eyes. The lock was undisturbed. His chair was still nailed. He let them into the house because the truth fit neatly inside the box of his life. He had no reason to hide. The sheriff and 2 deputies pried open the cellar, and then all the proofs, spilled forward like floodwater. It was not the bodies that stopped Daniel's breath. It was the sound of someone else coughing from between the boxes. The small labored sobbing of someone who had been kept in darkness for days. There were 2 women in the cellar, tied and filthy but alive. One had a cut on her forehead and the other could not speak without gagging. There were straps and ropes, a chair like the one Daniel had bolted upstairs, and a wall scrawled in uneven letters. "We don't leave it," said in thick, hurried handwriting. Daniel's mouth was dry. He felt nothing and everything at once, like a man watching a car wreck through a window, both horrified and removed. He had no memory of taking them or of the long roads, but someone had done it in his clothes, with his hands, using his truck. The sheriff read him his rights. Daniel tried to say the mirror was to blame, that the thing in the glass moved when he did not, but it sounded like a child blaming the moon. The deputy cuffed him, and his hands felt too heavy to lift. Someone, the one he thought of as the other, tapped at the glass of the mirror in the hallway as the deputies led him past. In the hospital, they called him by his name and asked him to remember. He tried. He pulled and pushed at his memory the way a man might pull at a stuck window, but there were knots tied inside him that could not be loosened by will. Images flashed, the deadened eyes of a woman, the smell of bleach, his own shadow in the street, and then nothing. They took him to a cell in the psychiatric ward that smelled of antiseptic and boiled linens. He lay on the institutional mattress and listened to the house recede into memory like a tide. He wanted to tell them the mirror had invited a hunger in him and taught him how to feed it, but the words would not form. He could only whisper that sometimes he heard it call, a voice that sounded like the backside of himself. Later, by law and by tired, careful testimony, the 2 women told their stories. They did not remember the driver's face. They remembered dark roads and the hands that held them. They remembered a small house and a narrow cellar and a man who laughed like it was a normal thing to keep people in the dark. They named Daniel because the sheriff had his jacket on the tape. They named the truck because the license plate matched the registration. Names and evidence braided until it was all a single thread that led back to him. At his hearing, the judge looked at him with the weary look of someone who has seen too many ordinary men become terrible by degrees. Daniel wanted to say it was the mirror that taught him how to lock the hands, how to silence a cry, how to make the cellar an efficient place. He wanted to say the voice educated him in the grammar of doing harm, but he could not explain the grammar, only the results. 2 living people rescued, damage done, a man whose hands had been used. He was committed to the psychiatric hospital. The deputies led him through the corridor and past the mirror's reflection in the hallway window where, for a second, he thought he saw his own face smiling at him with a mouth he had not used that way. He blinked and it was just a trick of light. He told himself to be sensible. But in the quiet of the ward, under fluorescent light and the hum of a vending machine down the hall, he discovered he could sometimes hear the whisper still. Not always, and not loudly, always behind the sound of the building, like a second radio. It said his name, and then it said other things. It told him he had been a good worker. It told him to wait. He received visitors, a neat-faced lawyer who smelled of coffee and a social worker who tried to look hopeful. His mother came, hands folded, and said she forgave him, because that is what mothers do, and he wanted to believe her. He wanted it with such hunger that for a moment it felt like the feeling the other thing used to make with its hollow smile. At night, in the locked room under the hum of fluorescent light, he rolled to his back and stared at the ceiling, and the whisper would come like the hush of leaves. It said, "You did fine. We did fine. We kept them." He would answer, sometimes aloud and sometimes only in his head, "I don't remember." The whisper would murmur back, placating, like a lover who forgives. "You don't need to remember." In the notes the doctors took, the handwriting became a new kind of evidence. Fragmented recollections. Times where the patient's blood pressure spiked when a certain word was spoken. Episodes of dissociation. They recommended medication, therapy, observation. The court recommended commitment. The town talked for a week, then on to other things. People still nodded to his mother on the street. They pretended it was a closed file. On his last night in the house before the ambulance, he went to the hall and stood before the mirror alone. The place felt empty, as if the rooms had already been unpacked and moved out. He placed his hand on the glass and felt cool, then nothing. He wanted to scream at the reflection and demand everything back. The hours, the names, the faces. He pressed his palm and listened to the hollow of the glass. The reflection smiled. The voice, patient, satisfied, said, "Be good. They will come to you like familiar things in time." He could not tell whether it was promising or threatening. They took him away at dawn. The deputies moved like a slow tide through his house, collecting the things that proved he was a man who lived here. The coffee cup, the lamp, the bolt-sawed chair. He watched them from the doorway, his hands in cuffs, his mind a clear pool with a single stone sinking. He wanted to tell that part of himself not to drown, but he could not form the words that would keep things tethered to his name. In the psychiatric hospital, the mirror did not hang. There was a different kind of glass there, safer, institutional. But sometimes, when the lights buzzed and the night staff wheeled a cart down the corridor, he would swear he saw a movement on the other side of his room window, a slow smile that did not belong to the world outside. They put him in therapy, measured him, dosed him. He learned the words they taught, dissociation, the stress-induced fugue. and he learned to say them with the correct calm. He narrated episodes he could not verify. He rehearsed answers until they fit the neat boxes on the forms. He sat and tried to build a truth. Months later, when the town had almost forgotten which houses had once been in the papers and which had not, a neighbor who worked nights saw a figure on the porch of Daniel's old house. The porch light burned, and in the window, the old mirror hung like a dark eye. For a moment, the neighbor thought he saw two shadows move in tandem inside the hall, one turning toward the glass, the other turning away. He rubbed his eyes and told himself the heat made things look strange. Daniel's case file acquired the quiet title of tragedy in the local paper. It became one more folded page in a town story about what happens when ordinary people variety the wrong way. He sat in rooms with beige walls and watched other men with small secret griefs. He spoke into microphones stuffed with tape and said the words the doctors asked him to say. He planted tomatoes in a garden the staff allowed and watched them die in the heat as if the soil remembered better than he did. On a rainy afternoon years later, a night nurse brought him a report to sign. He looked down at the line that said risk of recurrence, low, and thought of the cellar and the two women who had glanced at him with something like pity as deputies led him away. He signed because his hand moved, because a man signs when asked, and because the paper would not burn if he set it on fire. When his hands were empty, he sometimes heard the whisper again, but quieter now, as if the glass had lost weight. It said wait. It said later. It said we will find a way. Outside, the Texas sun sat heavy on the streets, and someone folded the town's paper and took the story with them, like a small stone tossed into quiet water. The mirror stayed where it had always stayed once the house was cleared. The house stood empty for months, and every so often a curious kid would put a pebble against the window and run away, daring the dark to answer. Daniel sat on the hospital bench and watched feet pass in the hall, and sometimes he touched his face as if checking for cracks. He was clean-shaven and wore a thin gown, and when the light caught the corner of his jaw, he looked like a man who had almost been saved. But when the nurse turned away, the whisper came soft and close as a moth's wing. "We kept them," it breathed. "You did fine."